Let's move on to Andrew D. Basiago. Andrew is a lawyer in private practice in Washington State, a writer, and a 21st century visionary. He holds not one, but 5 academic degrees, including a BA in history from UCLA and a Master of Philosophy from the University of Cambridge. Andy is a leading figure in the truth movement who is heading a campaign to lobby the United States government to disclose such controversial truths as the fact that Mars harbors life and that the United States has achieved quantum access to past and future events. He has been identified as the first of 2 major planetary whistleblowers predicted by Alta, the web-bot project that analyzes the content of the World Wide Web to discern future trends. Andy's writings place him at the forefront of contemporary Mars research. His paper, The Discovery of Life on Mars, published in 2008, was the first work to prove that Mars is an inhabited planet. After publishing his landmark paper, Andy founded the Mars Anomaly Research Society. Andy is also one of America's time travel pioneers. In the late 1960s and early 70s, he was a child participant in the secret U.S. time-space program Project Pegasus. He was the first American child to teleport and took part in probes to past and future events utilizing different forms of time travel, and then being researched and developed by DARPA. For 10 years, Andy has investigated his experiences in Project Pegasus on a quest to prove them and communicate them to others. Soon he will publish a tell-all book that will describe his awe-inspiring and terrifying experiences in Project Pegasus and the true story of the emergence of time travel in the U.S. defense community 40 years ago. It is always an honor to have you on the program. Andrew, welcome.
Thank you, Dr. Dream. It's an honor to be here, especially amidst such a distinguished panel involving, including Alfred Lambermont Weber, yourself, the wonderful Laura Magdalene Eisenhower, and the utterly fascinating gentleman that I've just had the pleasure of encountering for the first time, Randy Kramer. And I should add that while Randy was speaking, I was writing down different similarities and differences between our experiences, just so we could distinguish them later in the program. I always like to clarify the point that I was in 2 distinctly different, but to some extent related, secret defense projects. You mentioned DARPA's Project Pegasus, which took place for me at least between 1968 and 72 when I was age 7 to 11. And then I was called back into government service in 1980, and again, relatively unwittingly and without my consent, was involved in the CIA's Mars Jump Room program. So let me take it forward from 1980, because of course today the focus of today's discussion is human visitation of Mars and the various covert U.S. projects that have been taking U.S. personnel to Mars. Really before 1980, because of course we have the account of Michael C. Relf having first gone up in 1976. In the summer of 1980, my late father, Raymond F. Basiago, who was a special projects engineer for the Ralph M. Parsons Company of Pasadena, California, one of the nation's leading and largest defense contractors, told me that he was going to be taking me to the Mount Shasta area for a father and son vacation. I had vacationed with my family beginning at age 3 in 1964. I was the youngest of 5, and so it was quite normal for us when we were on the East Coast to vacation in Maine and the Adirondacks in New York State. And after we moved to Southern California in 1972, right after my experiences in Project Pegasus ended as an 11-year-old, we began camping in California, Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia every summer. But what my dad informed me in around July of 1980 is that this year we would simply be going as father and son. My mother would not be going. My 4 older brothers and sisters would not be with us, but it would just be a special vacation between he and I. I had just completed a year of college, my freshman year, at UC San Diego, with plans to enroll at UCLA in the fall. And when we drove early on a Saturday morning in August of 1980, it was the middle of 1980, and I've actually verified that by the fact that something very significant happened historically involving Lech Walesa, the Polish activist with Solidarity in Poland. And my dad was the son of Polish immigrants, so ethnically he was 100% Polish. So we were following Lech Walesa's career in Poland, and so I'm able to date the time we left the house for Mount Shasta as the middle of August of 1980 with high certainty. So we got up very early in the morning, attached the boat to our pickup truck, and began the trip from Chatsworth, California, in the Los Angeles region, up to the Mount Shasta area, which is a fairly long drive, but one that you can make if you start early enough in the morning. And as we got into the Shasta area, the strange things that would happen for the next 3.5 weeks began happening. The first strange thing was that we exited the I-5 corridor at exit 745, which, if you proceed for 9 miles north by northeast, you reach the town of McLeod, California. And there's a market there called the McLeod Market. In those days, the street that in front of it had not been made, and there was just kind of a sprawling blacktop that was irregular because they had just simply laid macadam over kind of an irregular surface. So the parking lot sort of had bumps in it. We kind of ambled into that parking lot with our vehicle and boat that we were towing. And my dad's attitude grew very serious, because up to that point he had just told me that we were going on a vacation, which would have involved probably a lot of fishing and boating and water skiing. And he said, "Son, I'm going to be going into the McLeod Market here for about 15 minutes. I'll be back soon. Whatever you do, do not leave the car unless it's on fire or somebody forces you out at gunpoint. Do everything you can to stay with the vehicle. And I'll be out of the McLeod Market here in about 15 minutes." Well, as he promised, he did come out of the McLeod Market in 15 minutes, but with a 5-day growth of beard. And before he even really turned the key of the vehicle to move forward to Shasta and to our destination, which was Lake Siskiyou, which would have been. Actually, Lake Siskiyou is at exit 739, so he actually went 6 miles, or at least 6 freeway exits north of our destination to go into the McLeod Market. And I said, "Dad, what happened?" And he goes, "What do you mean, son?" And I said, "Well, you have a 5-day growth of beard. Where'd you get that in 15 minutes?" And he said, "Oh, I always let my beard grow when we go camping." And I said, "Dad, that just doesn't cut it. You were clean shaven, and now you look like you've been somewhere else for 5 days." And he said, "No, son, my beard just must be growing quickly. I always let it grow like this when we're camping. You've known that since you were a small child." And so I think what probably happened, especially since there had to have been a passage of time. I mean, when we're time traveling, we age in the ordinary diurnal sense. The whole notion that H.G. Wells propagated, that you accelerate in time-space, and hence your biological activities accelerate, which has been talked about extensively during the space age, that, for example, going into outer space would arrest aging slightly, is not true. What happens with time travel is you go places quickly, and then while you're there in quantum displacement, you age in the ordinary diurnal sense, and then you're often returned to the time of your point of embarkation, which means that you've aged biologically in a way that is not reflected in your historical age. So, for example, during his career on Project Pegasus, my dad spent 8 years in quantum displacement in New Mexico. So when he died in 1990, historically at age 66, he was actually biologically 74 years of age. And he and Raymond Kubik, the man who introduced my parents in life and their marriage resulted, spent the better part of an afternoon at Parsons one day calculating that my father, in fact, was 8 years older biologically than his historical age. as a result of the quantum displacement in New Mexico. Okay, so he had to have been quantum displaced and then come back for his biological aging to have reflected a 5-day growth of his beard. My dad had black hair as a young man and a very full black beard, even though he was white-haired by that age. In 1980, he was already 57, having been born in 1923. So he was 57 historically, but let's do the math here. 65 biologically, although he was 57 chronologically. We always used to kid him about looking like Ernest Hemingway when we were camping because of his white hair and his dark beard. Clearly he had been sent somewhere. But I really couldn't get much traction with my dad. I mean, he was career CIA. He had first entered the U.S. government responses to the extraterrestrial presence. In 1952, he had been working at Oakenite Corporation, or Oakenite Company in Paramus, New Jersey. He had a military officer appear at his desk at Oakenite, and he was given military orders to report at the Curtiss Wright Aeronautical Company facility in Wood Ridge, New Jersey, the next Monday, to work on, he would learn, the ramjet engine project, which he designed the metallurgy for. The ramjet was going to be a space plane that would function in our atmosphere and our near-Earth environment to intercept and chase extraterrestrial craft out of our atmosphere and near-Earth environment. That project of October 1952 that my dad was summoned into by the government, followed by several months, the very famous July 1952 overflight of Washington, D.C. By 9 extraterrestrial craft clocked at Langley Air Force Base as traveling at 7,000 miles per hour, which was far beyond the flight capability of any craft in the world at that time, both American and Soviet, for example. And so my dad was brought in as an engineer to something that, of course, Laura's great-grandfather, President Eisenhower, would cope with following his election as President of the United States in November of 1952, which was the fact that after World War II and the advent of atomic weaponry, we clearly had put other groups, other planetary civilizations on notice that we not only were here in this area of the cosmos, the spiral arm of the Milky Way galaxy, 165 million light years from its relative center, but that we were doing something extremely cosmically foolish, which was destroying the physical substrates of the universe through nuclear fission by blowing up atomic bombs. And so my dad was in a very pressured professional status really from that time forward until his retirement in 1984. He not only worked on the ramjet and designed a metallurgical alloy that would allow it to not melt from friction by contact with molecules of air in our atmosphere and particles of space dust when it went into outer space, but he designed the instrumentation for the strategic bomber, which was known as the B-70, which was going to be the flying Chernobyl, the atomic-powered strategic bomber. And sometime in the mid-1960s, he was called into Project Pegasus to work on the development of time travel, utilizing ultimately eight different modalities of time travel for the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, which was then known not as DARPA, but as ARPA. Now, was my dad qualified to do that? Yes. In fact, he was an honors graduate in engineering from Lehigh University in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, where he had done half of his course of studies in electrical engineering, which is very germane to time travel and teleportation. Essentially, Tesla teleportation is an electrical engineering application. And he had done the other half of his course of studies, 25% in physics and 25% in math. My father was a brilliant mathematician. In fact, when he was working at the Thomas A. Edison Research Labs in West Orange, New Jersey, after leaving Curtiss Wright, where he was employed from 1956 to 64, and as he would later say, we were on the precipice of developing time travel at the Edison Labs, where among his colleagues was J.B. Johnson, who had discovered white noise in 1928. So there were just some distinguished physicists and engineers at that think tank. He had was performing for those 8 years at the Edison Labs, primarily mathematical proofs of the operation of dozens of electronic components that were ultimately purchased by Robert Noyce, and through that ingathering of different devices, Intel Corporation was founded. So my dad was actually doing mathematical tests of the sufficiency of electronic components that became part of the hardware bulwark of the personal computer revolution later, after the founding of Intel Corporation by Noyce and the advances of the Fairchild 8, who were included individuals like Dr. William Shockley. So he was brought into Project Pegasus sometime in the mid-1960s. In 1966, he joined Parsons-Jordan Corporation. I believe that Parsons-Jordan was the initial cover for the time travel program Project Pegasus. Ostensibly, it had a single client, which was Alcoa, the copper manufacturer, and a single contract, which was the Alcoa copper contract in Chile. And my dad made many trips to Chile to consult, not Alcoa, but Anaconda Corporation. Alcoa is the aluminum manufacturer, but the copper manufacturer was Anaconda, and it had major holdings in Chile. So my dad was in Chile before and after the rise and fall, the toppling of Salvador Allende as president of Chile. And I know around that time of the fall of Allende, which was very brutal and anti-democratic, my father was performing intelligence operations for the CIA. I was even present when a local CIA technician in our hometown of Morris Plains, New Jersey, showed my father a small camera with which he could take covert photographs in Chile. So, like many of our fathers and mothers during the Cold War, working for these top defense contractors, they had a sort of a second identity as a member of the intelligence community. In fact, my dad had an alternate name and alternate identification papers as Henry Przybski, who was a high school friend of his while he was growing up in Summit Hill, Pennsylvania, who had tragically been killed as a combat fatality in World War II. And the CIA had used Henry Przybski's identity to afford my dad a second covert identity in what was called the Second Reserve of the U.S. Army, which as a major allowed him the capacity to get on different military bases, different defense contractor locations that were under armed guard. And I know that because my dad once took me up to Camp Kilmer, the Army base, the sprawling Army base in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And after showing his credentials, his identification, the guard stepped back from our vehicle and saluted my father and said, "You may proceed, Major." And I turned to my dad and said, "Dad, I thought you were private first class as an ambulance driver and combat medic in France and Germany during the war." I didn't say that, but I'm providing that information now. I said, "Dad, I thought you were a private during the war." And he said, "I was, but now I'm a major in this this secret fifth column," he put it, that the U.S. government has maintained, which is called the Second Reserve, and we're going to be called up and become the frontline political and military leadership of the country if, for example, we're invaded by the Soviet Army and our civilian leadership and our standing military leadership are captured or killed. So my dad was definitely immersed in not just defense work, but in covert intelligence work and continuity of government activities by the time I was 4 or 5 years old. Like I'm dating it from 1966 when he joined Parsons-Jordan. It just was incredible, by the way, that Parsons-Jordan would just have one contract, being the copper contract with Anaconda. Now, I was called into Project Pegasus myself unofficially when I teleported from Curtiss-Wright to the Santa Fe, New Mexico State Capitol grounds with my father, and we've dated that to probably with a pretty high degree of certainty my first grade year, specifically around February of 1968. So Tesla teleportation was fully operational in the defense technical community 25 years after Tesla's passing in January of 1943, because I found myself starting to teleport with my dad beginning in winter of 1968 when I was age 6. The other major component of Project Pegasus primarily was chronovision, the ability to propagate a holographic image of a past or future event, so you could use it as a looking glass if you looked at the hologram. But if the hologram was formed around you, you would experience going to that past or future time and place. So those were my major activities in Pegasus, primarily teleporting back and forth between the country, going to primarily past locations via chronovision, and then participating in some truly experimental activities, for example, with other forms of physical time travel, including plasma confinement, where a radioactive plasma field is created around you to displace you in time, and also the jump rooms that we would later take to Mars were under development right as I was leaving Project Pegasus as an 11-year-old in 71, 72. So I know that the Mars jump rooms were already under development in Project Pegasus, and in that sense, Pegasus can be viewed as a knock-on activity or a continuation. Excuse me, the Mars jump room program can be viewed as a sort of a knock-on activity of Project Pegasus. My colleague Bernard Mendez, my fellow U.S. chrononaut and Mars jumper, believes that Project Pegasus actually included all of these programs where forms of quantum manipulation, that is time travel, were utilized, including the Mars jump room program. So we then moved to California. I had a very, obviously, stressful adolescence. Adolescence is always kind of tough. As the new kid from New Jersey in Southern California, and I attended junior high school and high school at Chatsworth High School in Chatsworth, California. I ultimately adapted to California and enjoyed myself immensely in high school, and I was the editor-in-chief of the school paper. I was playing saxophone in the school musical groups. I was wrestling, and I think I graduated with honors, and after being voted by my peers most respected and most likely to succeed. So by the time I left high school, I clearly was a well-adjusted individual, despite the move from New Jersey and, adapting to a different culture in suburban Los Angeles than suburban New Jersey. So I certainly was known in my community by the time I graduated from high school, and based on something that Courtney Hunt, one of the CIA trainers for the jump room program, stated, I think, believe it or not, I think being voted to those honors in my senior superlatives may have actually been recorded by the government, because when I asked him why I was selected, he basically referenced those honors, which is really amazing if you think about it, that the CIA could literally be monitoring a high school graduate regarding their senior superlatives. So I initially went to my freshman year down to UC San Diego because I was interested in studying writing, actually majoring in literature and taking courses in the writing program there and maybe becoming a science writer. I was thinking about becoming a lawyer back then, which I am now. Here in the state of Washington, I'm a lawyer in private practice, admitted to the Washington State Bar Association and the United States District Court for the Western District of Washington. So I've been practicing law for almost 20 years with no disciplinary history, no psychiatric issues, no history of drug or alcohol dependence, not even a client complaint. So I've now earned some credibility as a pillar of the community in Vancouver, Washington, where I've been practicing law for those almost 20 years. So I go off to UC San Diego, again, just like junior high and high school, nothing particularly strange happens. But then, summer of '80, year after my freshman year, my dad has taken me to the Shasta area, and he has gone on a 5-day disappearing act through a modest grocery store in McLeod, California. And so for those who know the Shasta area, they realize how absurd that sounds. I mean, this is a grocery store with cold drinks and fishing bait in it. Okay, it's not some kind of hardened government facility. So we then double back to the camping area at Shasta at north of Lake Siskiyou. There's a campground on the northern shores of Lake Siskiyou, off of exit 739, and we pitch our tent and begin setting up the campground. Being in the Army like that, my dad knew what to do with a shovel. Okay, he was kind of raising us to be capable to cope out in the woods. And so we got our campground set up very quickly. And about an hour later, a car arrived, and a father and son, relatively close to our age, stepped out. And they were Thomas J. Stillings, who was about 12 years younger than my dad. He was more or less in his 40s. And his son, younger than I, William Brett Stillings, Brett was then 13, I was 18, stepped out of their van. It was a distinctly pumpkin orange van, we remember. And without even setting up their tent, or their popping up, the tent device on their van, came over to our campground. And the first thing that Thomas J. Stillings announced to my father as he was shaking his hand was, "You may not know me, but we're employed by the same company." And he emphasized the word company. This, of course, was locutionary communication to indicate that they were both CIA, members of the company, the CIA. We then commiserated, and my dad said he explained how he was employed by Parsons. Thomas J. Stillings, who had served in the U.S. Navy as a lieutenant when he was younger, described how he was employed as an operations analyst with Lockheed Skunk Works of Burbank, California. I would learn during my investigation that the Mars Jump Room program was a joint venture of Parsons and Lockheed, and hence that may explain why from that moment on in the campground, Brett Stillings and I were sort of twinned as young men from Southern California who would ultimately take the jump room to Mars. Then we pretty much just sat around in lawn chairs, and when we were doing that, Tom Stillings had Brett go back to their camper and get a shoebox. And Brett brought that back to our campsite and said, and then Tom Stillings opened the shoebox and said, "I don't have to show this to you, Ray, because you're presently working with this." So now here we have Tom Stillings aware of the fact that my dad was working in anti-gravitic applications. By the way, anti-gravity is a misnomer. Anti-gravitic devices are reverse magnetic, in the same way that when you put the common pole of two magnets together and they naturally repel each other, the anti-gravitic craft are reverse magnetic, interacting with the polarity of metals in the ground, just as this small piece of what Tom Stillings called an example of boundary layer material was. Okay, and so here we have Tom Stillings in possession of some kind of exotic technology or exotic material, as it were. We then sit around the campfire. We retire. The next day we get up. We fix breakfast. We again sit around the campsite just talking. And promptly at 1 p.m., my father and Thomas J. Stillings stood up, just bolt upright. They just got out of their lawn chairs and walked purposefully toward on an angle towards an adjacent campsite. Brett and I, being 13 and 18, and quite spry compared to our middle-aged dads, ran ahead of them in the direction that they were going, in this diagonal across the campgrounds. And we walked between a vehicle and it was a sort of a car and a camper. And as we were making our way through that narrow passage, we were confronted by somebody who we certainly knew as children of the 1960s. I was born in 61, Brett in 1966. And that was astronaut Edwin Aldrin, Jr., that is to say, Buzz Aldrin. And he confronted us sort of in front of the vehicles before he sort of repelled us. We sort of stepped back a couple as he came through the passage between the two vehicles. And so we're now in front of his campsite, in front of the vehicles. And this is almost a verbatim statement of what he said, because one of the reasons I was selected for Project Pegasus as ultimately, I guess, an 8-year-old in fall of 1969, officially, when I was officially brought into Pegasus, is I have a very capable memory. So I can go back to conversations that were held decades ago and remember almost precisely what was said. And what Buzz Aldrin said to us is, "Andy, Brett, pleased to meet you, fellas. Well, let me tell you, you're going to be doing something in a short period of time that I did a few years back, and that's go off planet. And let me tell you, fellas, it's going to be the opportunity of a lifetime. And Brett and I kind of looked at each other quizzically, like, was Buzz Aldrin joking? Why is Buzz Aldrin in this campsite, this campground? How did our fathers know he was here? What I later found out from Brett, actually, after Brett contacted me in March of 2010, is that when his father brought him to the Lake Siskiyou campgrounds, he also stopped at the McLeod Market and then came out of the market in 15 minutes with a 3-day growth of beard after shaving in the car. In other words, Tom Stilling shaved with an electric battery-powered or dash-powered shaver in the car, and then went into the McLeod Market and came out with a little bit less beard growth than my father, but maybe about 3 days of beard. So clearly our fathers were being tracked in something, and I speculate that whatever meeting they participated in for 5 days, whatever 5-day seminar they attended after taking the teleport under the McLeod Market or wherever they went, I think that astronaut Edwin Aldrin must have also been a participant because he knew our names and he knew our dads. There would have been a second reason for Buzz Aldrin to know my father, which is that in 1967 my dad had been investigated and cleared by the FBI to work on the instrumentation for the lunar module, and my father showed me the schematics for that project, labeled or entitled Lunar Landing Assembly Process, which was the classic setup, of the LEM being extruded from the front of the command module and reattaching and then being put down on the surface of the moon, and then the top blasting off to get off the moon, and everything that Jules Bergman would have described to us when the lunar landing happened. So I think that the relationship between Buzz Aldrin and my dad may have gone back to the lunar landing. Certainly they were both on it. At least my dad was on it initially before the contract to do that instrumentation went to Grumman rather than Parsons. Parsons Jordan obviously was where my dad had just been, and he left and joined Parsons about a year later. So his first project at Parsons apparently was going to be the instrumentation for the LEM. And of course, my dad had the background with the space planes and so forth, like the Ramjet engine project. Okay, so
Wait,
here
Andy, let's start pulling this together. I've got to stick with the time constraints here. So
yeah, I want it to go long because I know that we had 25 minutes. So I'll be less detailed. Okay, so that night in the campground, my dad announces that Brett and I are going to be enrolled in a local educational experience to go to learn everything about Mars. And when I asked him, why do we have to take this Mars seminar here this summer in the Shasta region, he said, because some of you kids in the program are going to be going there. The next morning, which we think was that first Monday in the middle of August of 80, we went up to the annex of College of the Siskiyous in Wairika, California, and we met the young people enrolled. We have identified 5 of those 10 young people. In addition to Brett Stillings and myself, our fellow students included Barry Satoro, a student at Occidental College in Eagle Rock, California, who we now know as President Barack Obama, Regina Elvira Dugan, who was then an undergraduate at Caltech at a young age, who would then become the first female director and the 19th director of DARPA after being appointed by President Obama on 7/2009, which was the 40th anniversary of the lunar landing, and also the future NASA pilot and astronaut who died aboard Space Shuttle Columbia in February of 2003, namely William Cameron McCool. We were variously, Brett was 13, Regina was 17, I was 18, William McCool was 5 years younger than myself, so he was 18, and Barry Satoro, that is to say Barry Obama, had just turned 19 on August 4th of 80. So that was the age range, not only of the 5 of us we've been able to identify, but of the 5 other participants that we have not been able to name. We have been able to name, however, everybody else in the room, including Bernard Mendez, who was then sort of an intelligence agent attached to the U.S. Air Force, who it was explained would audit the class and participate in our jump room experiences to investigate the project. We've been able to, all three of us, that is to say myself, William B. Stillings, and Bernard Mendez, have engaged in hundreds of hours of consultation on Skype and personally, and have identified our Mars training officer as Major Ed Dames, the remote viewing pioneer, who was then serving as a scientific and technical intelligence officer for the U.S. Army. And also, we've been able to identify the four parents who audited most of the class, namely my father Raymond, William Stillings' father Thomas Stillings, Barack Obama's putative mother, who may very well have simply been his adoptive mother and handler, a woman by the name of Stanley Ann Dunham, and frequently the mother of Regina Dugan was also auditing the class as a parent of one of the participants. We did 3.5 weeks of training from roughly mid-August to the end of the first week of September. Several days, however, before the conventional course ended, Ed Dames and my father approached myself, Barry, and Regina and announced that they were going to teleport us to the beginning of the summer in June, and we would be sequestered for several months, and each of us analyzing 4 inches of French intelligence documents about the planet Mars, about the human civilization on Mars, to give each of our theses as to whether or not the human civilization on Mars represented a threat to our human civilization on Earth, did not, or it could not be determined. I concluded that it did not, that we were the hegemons on Mars, because, for example, that French dossier, all of it in the French language, so I was able to only translate about 25% of it, indicated that several American astronauts died on the surface of Mars in 1964 after the Martian humanoid civilization promised to rescue them and then reneged. So that anecdote in the French dossier that we were asked to analyze for the CIA, by the way, indicated that there was a human civilization. We had some way of contacting it, presumably through some form of advanced radio, and that it had engaged in a, not a duplicitous way, but sort of a dichotomous way with our civilization by agreeing remotely to rescue several of our astronauts who were on Mars, and then declined, which indicates that they weren't necessarily allies of ours. And then also it indicates, of course, that we had a presence on Mars no later than 1964. And I'm absolutely certain about that year because that was when I was 3. I remember and so forth.
So, Andy, why don't you just go ahead and sum up for us?
Well, so then I ended up first jumping to Mars from a jump room in El Segundo, California in July of 81, the next summer. I ended up doing about 40 round trips to Mars from that July 81 to my last jump, which is in May of 84. And sitting here and listening to Randy, I can say that there are many points of similarity and some points of divergence. And so I hope that we can discuss those today.
Oh, absolutely. I'm certainly hoping those are things we can discuss as well. Those are some of my most interesting questions that I have to talk about as well. Thank you, Emil.